Larissa, how you doing today?
Fine, thanks.
I'm glad to hear that. For folks who don't know, we usually chat before I hit record on these conversations. So believe it or not, we were just talking about the weather because as we're recording this, it actually is a pertinent topic of conversations for both of our locales. Me, New York City, you, Columbia, Missouri, and we'll explain who Larissa is in a second. But first, I want to thank you, Larissa, for agreeing to partake in Did You Know That? Which is the interview series where I get to talk to interesting people about interesting topics. And this one has me geeking out a bit. I think I've done more reading and research on this topic than I've done on any of the other ones. So I hope everybody enjoys it. And for those who are watching, I want to thank you for doing so. If you're a returning visitor, much appreciated. If you're new, make sure you hit the subscribe button with the bell so you're notified when each and every episode goes live on Thursdays. And if you like the episode or previous episodes, be sure to give us a like. And if you want to engage in a conversation, the chat box below is always open. So for those who don't know me, my name is Sean O'Rourke. And when I'm not talking to interesting people, I'm actually helping companies prepare to be hacked as a cyber liability consultant for Combs & Company, which is an insurance brokerage firm in New York City. And now, Larissa, you're going to tell the fine folks who you are and what you do.
So my name is Larissa Lidsky, and I am the Dean of the University of Missouri School of Law. And I study First Amendment law, so freedom of expression, particularly as it exists in social media. And I spend a lot of time on defamation law, which has been very interesting lately. So,
Well, and that in of itself is a nutshell of why I desperately wanted to have you on the channel, because this has been a topic that has been bantied about for the last decade. Well, more than a decade now, probably a decade and a half, I guess, at least since Facebook really started to take off in the mid-aughts. And but the first question I do want to ask you is, what came first? Was it First Amendment or was it internet for your interest and focus?
well, it started with traditional media and the defamation law for traditional media, newspapers, television, broadcasters. And then a student in the early days of the internet, when I started teaching around 1995, wrote this incredible paper in my seminar about social media defamation law. And that student got me interested in it. And as a result, that's really what my core expertise as a law professor has been.
Okay.
So it was a student who inspired me rather than vice versa.
That is great. And since you said 1995, that was actually before the CDMA, of which we're going to talk about. But the first question is, are there different rules or laws when it comes to speech on the internet versus traditional media?
So that answer happens to be yes and no.
Okay.
So I don't want your listeners to think that there are no consequences for their speech in social media, because lots of people have learned the hard way that there are certainly dramatic consequences for what you thought was just casual conversation in social media. You can be sued for defamation, you can be sued for invasion of privacy, copyright violation. And so the norm for the most part for us as individuals, the normal laws that apply outside social media also apply inside social media. But there is one difference that's worth knowing about, and that's the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. And what it does is it immunizes the platforms mostly for content posted by their users. So when somebody posts something defamatory on Twitter or Facebook, Twitter and Facebook are not liable for that defamatory statement. That's different than traditional media. When the New York Times accepts an op-ed, for example, and it turns out that op-ed's defamatory, you can sue the New York Times for that.
Yeah. Because the New York Times had a role in publishing it, where Section 230, which, as the book title so eloquently puts, the 26 words that created the internet, essentially, basically says that as long as the website doesn't develop or participate in the development of the content, then it is basically held harmless from any content that is posted by a third party.
Yes, and part of the rationale for why that law was passed initially is that you wanted to encourage the platforms to get bad content off without being held liable because they were exercising editorial discretion. So you wanted to protect them if they exercised their editorial discretion and got it wrong. So part of it, part of the rationale for the law was to protect good faith censorship, if you will, of content on their platforms.
Or moderation, as
same thing.
I think that's the word. Yeah.
It's about
because it's
moderation.
the Good Samaritan provision of that section that does it. But so let's focus on current events because social media is in 2020 specifically, and obviously 2016. After the 2016 elections, social media, it turned from ISIS using social media to recruit members to foreign bodies, actors, I should say, trying to mess with democracy. But 2020 and the beginning of 2021 is a little bit different because of President Trump's Twitter feed, because of the riot at the Capitol, and then because of social media's response to that. So banning Trump's personal accounts, does that put, let's take somebody like Twitter who's permanently banned Trump from Twitter, does that put him potentially in the crosshairs of somebody saying, well, you're sort of taking a publishing action like the New York Times would. You're determining who, what, where, when, why, and how.
Yes, so Twitter and some of the other social media have received a lot of criticism around the editorial judgments they do make and the editorial judgments they don't make. And so, it crosses political lines. So the right tends to criticize them for things like banning Trump for life from Twitter. And then the left criticizes them for not banning Trump fast enough from Twitter. And so both of them are saying they don't deserve protection for their editorial decisions. We want to change the law so that they should be responsible for the editorial decisions that they are making both ways, both to moderate and take things down and not to moderate and not to take things down.
But can you even envision a fine line in that would be enforceable? Because when I think about it, I've thought about it a lot. I can't figure out a way how you would actually do that in a way that doesn't expose you to where these platforms become untenable then.
Well, the real problem, what distinguishes them from other media companies to such a large degree is the scope and scale.
Yeah.
Facebook has billions of users, and those billions of users are posting, multiple things per day. And so how, with your scope and scale, do you make the right decisions such that you're not subject to crippling liability? And Facebook is really trying now. They have an advisory board, and they're trying to mature and recognize that they are in fact a media company, which they denied for a long time. But liability, if it's deployed in the wrong way, could cripple those companies. It's not impossible. Something could eventually be done. I still happen to support the immunity that the Communications Decency Act gives because of this scope and scale problem. But I also think it's troubling that one company controls bottleneck access to such an important medium. And that's really disturbing, especially when their decisions of what to censor are non-transparent.
Well, and so you brought up two good points there, and the second one being transparency, I want to get to in a second, but the first one is when you say one company who controls that sort of that bottleneck, that access to information and the such, isn't the internet, or wasn't the purpose of the internet to eliminate those bottlenecks? I mean, I grew up with the internet as well, just like you did, and I remember all the jargon that came out of the 90s was just about that, is that this is going to be a free flow of information to the world at large. Did we get that wrong, or does that exist and people just don't know enough to go find other avenues?
Well, so I was an early technological optimist about the internet, and of course, some of that optimism wasn't justified. So one of the things that was said at the time, as you remember, is that this is the democratization of
Yes.
mass media.
Yes.
And anyone can reach an audience of thousands, millions, billions that they could never do before, because the media, the traditional media, acted as intermediaries, and unless you had wealth or power, you couldn't get through. And it's true that we have democratized to a large extent access to mass media, but it's not all it's it's not all that was envisioned, because of course you have to take the bitter with the sweet, and there's been some terrible things that come along with that. And then you have these companies that have replicated some of the bottleneck aspects of traditional mass media.
And
But if you say you want them to engage in editorial judgment, that's what you're asking them to do.
well, and that's so there is a provision within the CDMA about the Good Samaritan efforts to sort of take out, I believe it's child pornography, abusive or violent, anything that would incite violence, whether it be an image or words and the such. And I think there was a third one, I can't remember. So the sort of moving towards your transparency note, do you think, let's take the big ones, the social media big ones are making a good faith effort at this moderation, this editorial control of the content hitting their platforms?
I think the answer is a qualified yes. And let me explain why I say it's a qualified yes. These companies don't exist for public service goals. These companies exist to make money, and their consumers, their customers, are demanding that they do something now. And so they're starting to respond as a result of consumer demand, and also they're worried about regulation from our lawmakers. And so they're moving to do more, to engage in good faith efforts to take down problematic and dangerous content. But are they doing it out of the goodness of their hearts? No. But are they doing it? Yes, I think they are starting to move in that direction. And a lot of people criticize them, say they're late, but nonetheless, I think they're moving in the right direction.
So then let's go to your transparency, because you did say that there was a lack of transparency in those efforts. One, why do you think that? And two, what do you think that they can do in a stepped process to make it more transparent without necessarily overexposing themselves to make them susceptible to liability?
Yeah, it's not that there's no transparency. Sometimes they some of the companies give reports about, first off, they give reports about their policies, because the policies specify what they're going to take down and what they're not going to take down. And then sometimes they give reports about some takedown decisions, but I would like to see more cumulative reports about what kind of content on average is triggering a takedown, and is it, what is the political leaning of the things they take down? What kind of structures do they have in place? I think Facebook, with their new advisory board, is trying to get some of this right, but they're learning that it's super, super complicated, as you would expect.
Right.
I mean, it obviously is difficult even for a newspaper. I spend my job training people to recognize a defamatory statement, but it's really hard. I mean, I've been doing it for 30 years, and there are some issues where I'm like, it could be defamatory, maybe it's not defamatory. It's all about the context. It's all about the immediate context and the bigger social context. And so, it turned, and like I say, I've been doing it 30 years and I still find some of the decision making really hard.
Right.
And doing that at speed and at the scale of billions of posts per minute, it's not going to be perfect.
And maybe not possible currently with the current
Maybe
technology.
not entirely possible. I mean, algorithms can do certain things. They can't do everything. You've got to have a human back of it. And
Right.
how many humans is it going to take to really respond to the demand for the exercise of editorial judgment to take down dangerous or bad content?
And I'm not sure if the viewers that we have watching this or who will watch this understand that it is a human-driven process for YouTube, for Facebook, for Twitter. They have some AI that they use for images or potentially videos, but anything of the written word, it's almost exclusively human-driven because humans can only, to your point, understand that overall contextual nature of the written word, where AI just doesn't have that capability at the moment.
That's right. And, I've read, there was a really good piece, I think it was in the New Yorker a few years ago, about some of the people that work on the front lines making these takedown decisions and how traumatizing it is because they spend their days looking at the worst conceivable content you can imagine. And that's what they do for a living, is look at horrible things humans do. But yes, there's only so much AI can do. And then you've got to have an army of humans trained in this really sensitive contextual work.
And not everybody can get the subtlety of language. That's why if you try to outsource it to a non-native speaker, some things will get missed, some things will get flagged that shouldn't get flagged. I know there was the big controversy, I think it was Facebook, who took down the picture of the girl in Vietnam, the naked picture of the girl in Vietnam who'd been burned by napalm. I mean, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning photo. I mean, It's one of the most famous photos from Vietnam.
Right.
And Facebook pulled it down because their AI algorithm saw a naked young girl that they identified as potentially child pornography.
Yeah. No, it's really it's a really complicated task. And, I think it's unfair sometimes to the outcry over the mistakes. I mean, there are going to be mistakes. It's just part of the process. You're going to make editorial judgment mistakes. And the photo was ultimately restored after people complained. But yeah, that's a famous example of, they censored this award-winning photo in a way that they shouldn't have. Totally understandable how it happened, though.
Exactly. I mean, the AI was programmed by a human. I've given you these parameters. The AI is not smart enough to know, well, okay, this is a Pulitzer Prize, or it doesn't have a reference frame to say, okay, that's an award-winning photo that's of historical importance. That gets to stay, where this picture over here does not.
And if you start imposing liability, then you're going to create more incentives to take things down. And maybe that's what you want. It's not what I want personally, but there are people who would say, if in doubt, take it down. But that's going to come at the cost of the early promise of the internet to give us access to this immense amount of information. The other thing is, the people that are going to demand takedown are going to be the wealthy and powerful. And if you set up incentives to, if in doubt, take down, the system can be manipulated in a way that I don't think most of us would want.
Very easily manipulated or schemed, a la the patent process. Everybody's going to find a way, their own their own angle on it, and not everybody's going to like it. And I always say the pendulum always swings back.
It does.
You're saying take it down now, but maybe you'll be the one posting in a short order where your stuff's being taken down, and now all of a sudden you're out of it. I want to touch on 230 really quick because I don't think it's going to be any kind of immediacy. One, do you think it's a convenient whipping post at the moment?
Yes.
And then two, do you think Congress has any political will to do anything with that, or with the social media platforms or the internet in general, with any sort of real teeth?
That's a good question. So yes, I think it's a political football right now that is serving people's political interests by criticizing the big platforms. And I have to say, I don't particularly love some of the actions that the platforms engage in. I'm very cynical about some of the behavior of the platforms. I especially Facebook. I concerned about the market power of somebody that controls that much of a marketplace of ideas, being a non-governmental actor. It's really, there's some downsides to that. What concerns me is that you get the forces on the right and the forces on the left. Perhaps they do unite to bring change. What does that change look like? Like some of the bills would say, okay, Facebook, we will let you engage with editorial control. As long as you're neutral, you can keep your immunity. Well, who's judging neutral?
Right.
The government's judging neutral, and then the government can put pressure to manipulate what gets taken down and what gets left up. I don't think that's a very good solution. On the other hand, in Europe and other countries, they don't have the same immunity. They have immunity around notice and takedown immunity.
Right.
So if you're put on notice of problematic conduct, and then you either don't take it down or you take it down, you make the wrong decision, you can be liable only after you're put on notice of what they should take down. Might we ever go to a full notice and takedown system? I don't know. There's a lot of call for it right now, and like I say, it worries me when the left and right unite that maybe we might get that system.
You are a woman after my own heart. You're the type of cynical that I like. So that's good. But it's a valid point that, I'm not a huge fan of the EU's right to be forgotten. I think that, again, can be manipulated, though the EU does leave it to the discretions of the platforms. And so far, Google, being the 1,200-pound gorilla in the search world, seems to have a very judicious use of that and a very judicious take on it. But when I look at their numbers, the number of requests, they actually have a relatively small team that can handle those requests because they're not inundated with them like they thought they were going to be. Is the EU model, I won't say something that could be replicated in the US, but everybody talks about the pros of the EU model. What kind of cons do you see with that kind of environment where just making the request puts the platforms in a position to make the editorial control?
Yeah, well, I think what you see is that people who are wealthy or people who are powerful, usually both, can hire lawyers to do a series of takedown notices and potentially affect the public record. So what's on the internet, and particularly what's accessible by Google, is part of history now. It's part of how we know what happened in the past. And if that can be altered by the interest of somebody who's powerful, having the threat power of constant legal demands, then that really should be of concern to all of us. So I worry about the notice and takedown systems being manipulated. Here's the thing: American free speech law is often accused of exceptionalism. So American free speech exceptionalism.
I hate that word.
Yeah, there's certain things we protect more than any other country in the world. And some people would say that's a bad thing because you can have a democratic country that doesn't have the same free speech protections we do, and the world doesn't come to an end. All of that is true. The world wouldn't come to an end if we went to a notice and takedown system, but we don't really know what we would get. And I think it's good to have different regimes so that we can see the ills by comparing them. And I just don't think with our cultural history it's going to work for us, but it could.
Whether it works or not, I don't think it could pass, because going back real quick, I wanted to make or bring up an idea with you in terms of the moderation. I think one of the things that we lack on the transparency side was the reason something was taken down, or the reason somebody was banned, or the reason behind it. Now, the very public riot at the Capitol, they could give very concrete examples as to why certain things were taken down. But there's a lot of other things that we don't see, that we don't know about, that a lot of people get hit on, and there's no reason for it. It's just taken down, and then you can appeal this process, or there's no appeal to that process. And I think, to your point, in terms of the balance, if they had to expose the reason, I think people might be more comfortable then with what they were doing.
Yeah, and I think this is what's alarming about having the private company doing it. Because if the government regulates your speech, they have an obligation to give a reason, and it can be tested in a court. And so there's an appeal from the process to make sure it was carried out properly. If you're banned from live from this medium, that could have serious career ramifications for you. It could have personal ramifications for you. I mean, I know there are some kinds of quasi-appeal type processes, but what do you do? I personally don't love Facebook's business model, because I feel like they're treating me as a commodity to monetize my privacy to sell to advertisers.
Sure.
Periodically I say to myself, I'm going to get off Facebook. Within a week of me trying to get off Facebook, there's somebody from my past I need to contact. And the only way I have to get a hold of them is through Facebook. And so I always end up back on. But it kind of shows how powerful it is to be blocked from the medium entirely.
Right. All I can think about as soon as you said that was The Godfather Part 3 and Al Pacino's famous line, every time I want to get out, they pull me back in.
Pull you back in.
I'll be honest with you. I've never had a Facebook account. I do have an Instagram account, but I've never had a Facebook account.
Don't start.
No, I won't, for a myriad of reasons. One, that are, if we haven't stayed in touch, I'm not really not looking to rekindle what I did back in high school or grammar school kind of deal. But two, also for what you just said, you're a commodity. And I assume then you saw the Social Dilemma sort of mini documentary, which I thought was very good at explaining why social media does the way they do things, because all you are is a potential dollar figure to them.
Right. You're a niche market that they're serving
Exactly.
up to somebody. One of the things they did that was terrible. So I'm a cancer survivor, but while I was going through cancer, I had emailed friends telling them about my breast cancer diagnosis and that I was going through chemo. And I had not posted it on Facebook at that point, but I kept getting advertisements. Every third advertisement was about class action lawsuits based on the chemo drug I was taking, saying some women lost their hair and never got it back, and there was this class action lawsuit.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it was so terrible to keep getting these while you're on a medication that, as it turns out, has saved my life.
Right.
And you can see now I do, in fact, have my hair back again.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was just horrible. And it was based on my messenger emails. It wasn't even based on anything I had posted. And I just thought, this is abysmal. This is terrible.
Well, that's how you always know that they are listening, because I've said things aloud, haven't searched them, but said them aloud, and they have shown up on various feeds or as ads on various websites. So I do know they're listening. They're always listening.
They're always listening.
George Orwell's Big Brother, he gave it to the government. The government can't get out of its own way. It's all sort of these private companies and the such. I do want to ask you, the banning of Trump on Twitter, you know, they justified it based on the riot. Do you think it was the right decision? And two, would it have been different if Trump had been posting under the @POTUS handle as opposed to his personal handle?
Well, he certainly illustrates how there's very little distinction between those two things while you're in office. There probably is now that he's a former president, but while you're in office, the blending of the personal and the political in that way is a hallmark of social media. I think it was the right decision for the short term where the situation was incendiary and there was threatened violence and death. Mm-hmm. The riots resulted in people dying, that you needed to do something dramatic to try to cut off that incendiary situation. So yes, I think it was absolutely the right decision in the short term. A lifetime ban seems to me to be a different calculation. That you could say something that gets you banned for life, no matter what. I guess in the case of Trump, he of course has other avenues for speaking and getting his message out. But what if it is, not someone with that ability to speak? I don't know. It's a lot of power to be put in the hands of a private company. Like I say, for Trump, he can go to actually I would say he can go to lots of other outlets. And of course he can get an interview in the media anytime he wants. But eventually, if you're banned across all platforms, how do you get your message out today?
Yeah, and I'm not going to get into it, even though you have a very extensive background. I mean, you on the structure of the internet. I mean, I read your paper on the Onion DNS, and I think the removal from platforms of actual apps, like what happened with Parler and some other apps. Actually, nobody's really focused on that, but I think to a certain extent, maybe even more impactful than sort of just taking the account off. I think that from an Amazon perspective was Amazon's first swing of its own power on AWS.
Yeah, Amazon, they control 33% of the entire market for that. And so if you're banned from Amazon, like your Parler.
Yeah. So
it's a whole speech medium that is in one fell swoop taken off with, thousands or perhaps millions of speakers. And in one fell swoop, Amazon, with its, wisdom about editorial judgment, right, gets to decide you don't get to have your platform. That's really concerning. It's really non-transparent. It's really concerning. And when you have, again, Amazon controlling such a big swath of that market, that's censorship.
Well, but isn't it different? Because Amazon's just offering a platform on which to put your own platform. They're actually offering the baseline foundation for the internet access. And they just said, you know what, we're not going to do business with you anymore. You're not allowed to be on our platform. So there's other platforms that they can go to. They ended up going to a Russian platform, which I thought was great.
Yeah. I mean, they're a private company, right? Amazon's a private company. If they don't want to do business with you, they don't want to engage in a contract with you, they don't have to engage in a contract with you. I guess my critique of a lot of these things is that if you truly have other alternatives out in the marketplace, it's not a problem. But when you have these giant, they're not a lot of them aren't technically legal monopolies, but quasi, monopolistic type power that you control over a speech market, it raises some different public policy concerns. They're not First Amendment concerns, because the First Amendment only protects you against government interference with your speech. So they're not First Amendment concerns, but they're public policy concerns about letting private companies decide what we hear.
And I really would remind me, in case I forget, I want to get back to an ICANN like moderating entity for the platforms. But to your point about free speech, we are entitled to free speech, but there is no entitlement to a freedom from consequence to what you say. And I think a lot of people, especially on social media, sort of misinterpret that when bad things happen to them after they've said something inflammatory.
No, that's absolutely right. You may have a right to say it, but you may have to take the consequences, and that may be, you may become a social pariah as a result of something you say, and that is not a First Amendment problem. That is, that is a social problem.
But again, to your previous point about the subtleties and the complexities, however, where you say it, when you say it, and about whom you say it, actually may limit the type of consequences that you can suffer from a legal perspective on certain things. But again, that's getting down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. The test for legal incitement, what actually constitutes incitement, is a really, really, really high legal standard to meet. It's very hard to prosecute anybody for incitement. On the other hand, if you're using incendiary language, inciting language in the moral sense, but not that won't meet the legal standard, we can rightly criticize you for that. Mm-hmm. And you can suffer consequences for that. So I have, it's a different thing, is whether you could be prosecuted for it or whether people could say that was really inappropriate, wrong, and we don't want to have anything to do with you as a result.
So you can't be prosecuted, but you could be persecuted.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
I'm very proud of myself. Opinion. I just thought about that on the fly. So there you go.
Yes, in the
I might make that into a T-shirt for you.
That's right. That's right.
So I wanted to talk to you about the ICANN, and I won't go into the details for the viewers of what ICANN is, but basically they give out internet names.
Domain names. Yeah,
they basically put a stamp on it if you want a domain name.
Like a registry of domain names.
Correct. Yeah. And they're nonprofit, they're a non-governmental entity. There was some obviously controversy during the Obama administration that he wanted to sort of turn it loose to other countries. It's not necessarily happened to what he thought it would, but it's gotten a little bit more outside of the United States than it used to be. Do you think something like that would work as an appeals board for something like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or an entity like that, where they would basically be required to fund it? And that if, let's say, Larissa was banned off of Twitter because you said something and I complained about it, and you could go to Twitter, Twitter says, nope, we're sticking with it. Then you could go to this sort of higher board, the Supreme Court, to appeal it. Do you think something like that would work? And believe me, I just dumped it on you, but
I can like the arguments on both sides are coming to me. So on the one hand, I do think there's an advantage in that it has like a quasi governmental type status, like a buy-in, where it's not just the company making the decision. And the other advantage of it is that the decisions would be consistent across platforms. Because right now you can be banned on Facebook, not on Twitter, not on Instagram, it for the same exact conduct. Right. The same exact conduct can get you banned one place, not the other. So that's the good part of it. And I think it might be able to work. And I think the companies might welcome it. because the companies are discovering how hard this is as they're doing it under tremendous market pressure. And they might like to be relieved of some of the burden by having this. On the other hand, some people would say that one of the beauties of having this all in private hands right now is that there's a market that people can go to for the kinds of discourse they want to engage in. And so I can choose to go to a platform like Parler that has kind of different standards, different rules, or I could choose to go to a platform, that's more of a walled garden. That's more like the old AOL, right? Where I know they're going to be moderating and taking off anything that I don't want to see. And so I'm going to go choose a platform that's, more moderation heavy as opposed to one that's less moderation heavy. So I think there's definitely some advantages that I could see. Could it work if you got buy-in? Or maybe you don't need buy-in if you've got a governmental gun to the platform's head. So.
Well, and I'm wondering if that would take the gun, that would uncock the gun that is currently pointed at all of social media, is if they said, well, why don't you create something like this to help us out? Because to your point, this is a very expensive portion of their business. Not that they need all to be making more and more money, but it is a very expensive portion of their business. And they're having to make these investments. And I mean, I'm sure they would like to do something that frees them from the constant storm and drang from the political process. So I'm sure it's not fun if you're Mark Zuckerberg, not that I feel sorry for him, but I'm sure it's not fun to wake up every day reading you've been hit from the right, you've been hit from the left, you've been hit from the center. So you would like your company to stop being a political football. And if like a little cooperation might solve it, you might be okay with that. Yeah, because it would be akin to what the EU has in their cyber court system, for lack of a better term, as an analogy. Yeah. It would be very akin to what they do over there, where you have a right of appeal to a final court.
Well, and so that's the other thing. If you're Facebook, you're a global business. And so you're subject not just to the regulatory system of the US, you're subject to the regulatory system of France and Australia and China. So you're used to adapting to whatever regulatory system you're in. Perhaps it would be advantageous to you to have them all be more similar.
Right. Well, businesses like that, certainty is what they live for.
Because but what about, sorry.
No, I mean, it just makes your life easier.
I guess I'm always the skeptic that says, but what about us as citizens?
Yeah.
What do we want?
Right.
Facebook might acquiesce to it because it makes their business life easier. What do we fear might happen in terms of our ability to get the information we need without the government, distorting it in some way?
Well, and that was one of my questions here is who doesn't get their fair share of the blame is us. Is us, the posters on the platform. We're the ones actually causing all this chaos because of what we post on these platforms. Whether we do it anonymously or under our own name, we contribute to this chaos.
Yes. And what the real problem is that everything that we were like offline, we're still like that online. And now we just have a visible record of what we're really like. And it's a scary thing seeing what we human beings are really like in what used to be private spaces. Now they're made public by this medium.
Well, I actually find it better because I said this. I had a lot of people who complained after Trump won in 2016 and obviously started his rhetoric and whatnot. And then you heard other people chime in and whatnot. And people said, well, they should be shut off or they shouldn't be allowed on there. And I said, why? Then you go back to the old way where you've pushed them all to these dark corners and they operate out of these dark corners as opposed to just knowing who you're dealing with.
I agree. I want to know who I'm dealing with. I want to know what their thoughts are. If I have a public official that like their mental processes are like Trump's are, I want to see it. I follow Trump on Twitter, or I did. I did follow Trump on Twitter because it's the easiest way to really know what our public official is doing in his representative capacity on our behalf.
Well, and I do have to say, Trump, take it for whatever he wants. This is a non-political comment. His 2016 campaign was brilliant because he cut out traditional media. He spoke directly to the electorate. And I think some of the younger Democratic candidates missed out on that opportunity during the presidential campaign primaries for the Democrats by not doing the exact same thing themselves.
You know who didn't, though? I'll tell you who understands social media is AOC.
Yes. Yep.
So she has developed a following, and if you go at her on social media, she will come right back. And
right.
So she is like the left version of and
that.
It's interesting. It's brilliant.
Yes.
I mean, I say this non-politically too. I think they're both brilliant. Trump is brilliant at social media. AOC is brilliant at social media. And I know what they're about.
Exactly.
So it's not filtered through the New York Times. It's not filtered through the Washington Post, not filtered through the Wall Street Journal, which are the newspapers I typically read. So there, I know who they are. Isn't that good? And more people participated in this election than ever before.
Right.
I don't know what you attributed that to, but
I think I was having this conversation with somebody. I think to a certain extent, people were tired of what they saw on the channel and they wanted to change the channel. They didn't care what was on the other channel. They just wanted to change the channel.
Yeah.
And so they figured, but the exact opposite also participated. I mean, that's what people don't realize. Biden won, but Trump got a tremendous amount of votes.
That's right.
Out of the whole process. So I'm okay that both sides got a lot of votes out of it as long as people participated. And that was the thing that I found very intriguing, is that people were anxious to participate, and it was a lot closer than a lot of people thought it was going to be.
That's right. That's right. So I guess my one of my questions would be is, do enough of us listen really to the views of all sides, and how do the platforms play into that? Like whether we really are exposed to information that we don't already agree with, whether we really take seriously the other side. My whole career has been devoted to the idea that public discourse matters, and listening to people that you don't agree with matters, and that it changes public policy if we can all have these rich discussions together.
Right.
So whether that's happening or not is a good question.
But again, it's us. It's our fault. It's us, the posters and the consumers of those social media platforms. It's our fault. It's not the social media platform's fault. I actually said this to my wife after watching The Social Dilemma. I said, I should start a platform to where if you follow Trump, I immediately post nothing but Democratic stuff to you.
Yeah.
As an experiment. And if you follow, let's say, AOC, I post nothing but Trump and Ted
brilliant.
Cruz and what have you, just to see what would happen. Or if you follow AOC, maybe I post a moderate Democrat and a moderate Republican, because I think that's part of the problem, is that, to your point, we're, as consumers on social media platforms, they're only going to give us what they think will make them money.
Right. It's the clickbait model of discourse.
Right.
So that it has to be dramatic to garner outrage and then get shared virally. And so where do you go if you want all that moderate information? Is it really going to be available to you, or is it forcing us to our corners by the architecture Does the architecture of the platforms make us more polarized?
And believe me, in the history of the United States, there's been a lot more polarized times
Right.
than there are
That's right.
now. It's just with social media, it sort of gets amplified in people's minds. But there were a lot worse times than there
There
have
were a
been
lot
now.
worse times. I was just teaching my class last week. So the socialist candidate for president, Eugene Debs,
Oh, yeah.
went to jail for his speech, for his free speech.
Yep.
We don't, think about
Well,
that.
I mean, look, you don't have to go back too far to see what Nixon did when he was in 68 and 72. Forget Watergate, look at 68. I mean, they had a lot of dirty tricks. FDR did a lot of things that
Yeah.
people would look askance at and say, whoa, wait a second. We thought you were the hero of the Great Depression, World War II, and you were this guy? And
Yeah. Well, everybody should know about the election of 1800 and the Sedition Act of 1798, where
Right.
John Adams and the Federalists make it a crime to criticize them, but not the vice president, because the vice president was Thomas Jefferson and he was a Jeffersonian Republican. And so
Right.
they throw all the other newspaper editors from the other party in jail.
Yeah.
They actually jailed people that editorialized for the other newspapers
Well,
to try to keep in power.
Go look what Hearst did during the Spanish-American War, or
Oh,
lead
yeah.
up to the Spanish-American War. I mean, basically, he caused the war.
Yeah.
Okay, so to this point, because I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I can go on forever with you. Is it hyperbole to say that social media, one way or another, moderated, unmoderated, is a threat to free speech?
Oh, I think that's hyperbole.
Okay.
I think it's hyperbole.
Thank you.
I think like every other complex social phenomenon in history, including the printing press, that it has tremendously positive attributes, tremendously negative attributes, and you take the bitter with the sweet. And every complex social phenomenon it doesn't have one nature.
Right. So it's a complex issue. It's like us. Well, I did, and I missed the question when we were talking about 230, Section 230, and I would like to go back to it because as a lawyer, I always like to get your insights into it because a lot of us don't know how sort of the view from a judge's bench goes when it comes to interpreting law. Did Section 230 become what it is today because of the way it was written or the way it was interpreted? And do you think to a certain extent or at all that it was misinterpreted by the judicial body?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Okay. So you have to distinguish between kind of the legislative history, what Congress thought it was doing in 230.
Yeah.
And what some people said they were doing, they were protecting Good Samaritans, and the actual text of the statute.
Right.
And the actual text of the statute is incredibly broad and protects you basically almost no matter what.
Right.
Any kind of editorial judgment you exercise, good faith, bad faith, doesn't matter. The text of the statute really protects you. And the judges said, we're going with the text, friends. We're looking at the text of what Congress wrote. And if it doesn't quite match that they only intended to protect Good Samaritans, well, they should have written it that way.
Right.
So did the judge, in some of the famous early cases like Zoran versus AOL, did the judge interpret it broadly? Yes, he did. But that was faithful to the actual words written in the statute itself.
Okay. So how would you have interpreted it? Let's put you in one of those cases. Would you have gone broad? Would you have gone narrow? Would you have tried to split the middle? I mean, obviously I'm trying to ask you this 20 plus years later.
Yeah, the only other choice at the time really was a notice and takedown regime. So if I put you on notice that there's something wrong with your content, and you don't take it down, then you're going to end up being held liable. You lose your immunity and you can end up being held liable if you got it wrong. And so I would have gone with the text, and I would have gone with it in light of what the internet looked like at the time,
Right.
where it just was impossible to moderate every nook and cranny of the internet. It just wasn't possible.
The internet was infinitely smaller than it is now.
It was infinitely smaller than it is now, and it was impossible to exercise that moderation, and liability could have shut it down in its infancy. And so I think the text is right. I think the judges got it right, and I would have done the same thing, even knowing what I know now.
And there have been cases where people have complained and received a assurance that it would be taken down or changed or whatever, and it wasn't done. And that's where the companies were held. Well, wait a second, you made a promise, you didn't keep it, and so you're not covered anymore, because you can't promise something and then not keep it. So it wasn't that you violated 230, it's you violated your promise.
Your promissory estoppel, basically a quasi-contract that you made with me to take it down. Yeah, I mean, even that's like a way to try to say, you didn't behave as you were supposed to, you made a mistake, because it's really based on a mistake. And right now, does it bother me if Twitter has to pay $100,000 here and there? Not at the margins, but how often is that going to be replicated?
Right. Because if you have to pay 100,000 times.
Right. Eventually it's real money.
Yeah, exactly. Even for somebody like Twitter or Facebook or what have you.
Somebody like Twitter. Yeah.
And that's why I find Amazon so fascinating, because while they're in the crosshairs because Bezos is worth a gazillion dollars. And by the way, Bezos and Elon Musk, they're not carrying that cash around in their pocket. They're just worth that.
Yeah.
They don't have that cash. Anyway, Amazon sits in a very unique position to where they're not really part of this chaos, but they do, to your point, have tremendous power over what gets delivered on the internet. And I'm wondering, again, back to a previous question, do you think Congress, one, realizes that's the real power that they have, not their e-commerce power? And two, do you think there's any kind of will above and beyond Elizabeth Warren and some of the far left who want to break up the tech companies really understand where Amazon's power lies?
I don't think so right now. Because I don't think it can be right now. I don't think it can be leveraged as easily into something that galvanizes public opinion, right? It doesn't have the same. Well,
especially during a pandemic when they saved a lot of people last year.
Yeah. I mean, Bezos has gotten a lot of criticism for owning the Washington Post. People call it the Amazon Post. And people are really concerned about the Bezos influence that way, but I don't think most people are focused on this other issue. I don't even think Congress is focused on this other issue.
That worries me more than the social media platforms.
Me too.
Because that's the gateway to the internet. I mean, that's literally the internet right there.
There's a brilliant scholar that's written about other kinds of censorship, collateral censorship, all the ways that you can censor. And his name's Derek Bambauer, and he's in Arizona. And I wish every congressperson would read Derek Bambauer's work about censorship doesn't always look like what you think it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, in using the word censorship, I've been using it loosely here. Technically, censorship is only about the government censoring people. Technically, the term censorship only refers to government censorship. But I guess so. This is really more about the platforms or Amazon.
Yeah, but the feel of that word can be used and is very apropos for what can be done to you elsewhere.
Yeah. If we can't hear the information or we can't speak, it has the same effect.
Right.
So
So I'm going to close this out with a question as to how you think things go from here, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years. Let's say legislatively, either at the federal level or even at the state levels, because I mean, I live in New York State. New York's got now Part 500 for the Department of Financial Services. They have the SHIELD law. California's got now 2 laws, CCPA, CCPR, on the books. A lot of American companies are subject to GDPR in the EU.
Right.
Do you see a legislative push, again, state or federal level, for some sort of control of the internet, of internet access, of free speech?
I do. I guess
it's a loaded question, so take your time.
It's a super complicated issue, but I think the kind of public, there's been an erosion, I think, of public support, particularly in the younger generation, for the kind of libertarian conception of freedom of speech that's been the dominant model most of my lifetime. Actually, it goes back before that. So I think that there's like the skepticism of government regulation that I feel in a bone deep way. I don't think that's shared that widely anymore. I think it used to be shared widely, but I don't think it's shared that widely. And when you don't have that, a lot of this proposed legislation sounds like it's a good thing. You know, it's all well-intentioned. It's all to protect people, and some of it's in the name of protecting public discourse, which, as I say, I completely believe in the power of public discourse and the need for public discourse to save our democracy. But I think that deep skepticism that I have of governmental action is just not as widely shared anymore.
That we could dovetail into a whole philosophical and psychological sort of thinking on why that is. I think if somebody once said, freedom is tough, freedom takes work. And that's why you don't see it in a lot of places, because people don't want to work that hard to be free. And maybe technology has made us to where, well, I just want somebody to tell me.
Well, it makes us believe in magic solutions potentially. Right. Like a certain kind of technological optimism thinks we could solve all the problems through algorithms, or
right.
It's just not going to work. It's still human beings at the end of the day.
Like I could take a pill and get in shape.
Yeah, I wish.
I'm sorry, I do have one more question, because it was my last question on here that I created, and I know we've gone over, but it relates to your original area of focus on traditional media. Has the traditional media, because still the majority of people in the United States get their news from TV, newspapers, magazines, and radio. Have they lived up to their role as the fourth estate, or is some of what we see here some of the erosion that we've seen due to the fact that they are not doing the job that they profess to be doing?
I certainly think that although there's been some very, very fine journalism in the last few years, that overall they are not doing the job. And part of it is not about blame. Part of it is not their fault. Their business model fell out from underneath them. And what you got when the internet shattered the business model of relying on advertising to fund your newspaper, for example.
Sure.
And as a result of that, you had about 40% of newsrooms being decimated, right? Layoffs of 40% of the talent, and it is talent in your newsroom. And so what do you think you're going to get when you, and like I say, I want to say talent in your newsroom, but it's more than decimate, because decimate is 10%. So, half of the people that have devoted their lives to this enterprise and their skills and their expertise are suddenly missing. And then you replicate that with the hardest hit news media have been the local news media, the people that go to those boring school board meetings, and they go to those boring, hearings in the local court. city council meetings, and they understand what they're hearing when they go there because they've been to lots of them. It's not their first time at the rodeo. So do I think that on a whole, the media are performing their jobs adequately? No, I don't.
And to your point
we're
about the
seeing
local
some
one,
experiments to fix it. Yeah.
yeah, to the local one, I've seen that here in New York City. I mean,
Yeah.
definitely here.
Well, if you're a person who gets media calls, you are, it's the number of reporters that call you that have really done the background work, that understand, versus the 22-year-old who maybe doesn't have that expertise. You see a difference.
Jimmy Breslin, where have you gone?
Or maybe it's just a sign I'm old. That could be it too.
Well, you know what? You and I are in the same category then. So, then that's just the way it is. And the next generation is going to have to learn the hard way how it goes. Larissa, this was fantastic. I could keep going, but you're the dean of a law school. So sitting here gabbing away with me is probably not necessarily what's on your calendar for the rest of the day. I really do want to thank you. This was one of my favorite conversations. If you ever get a chance, you are more than welcome back for a part 2. But you were great, and I really appreciate it.
It was fun.
And I really appreciate everybody for tuning in. Thank you very much. This is Did You Know That? ? Where I talk to interesting people about interesting things. And for Larissa, my name is Sean O'Rourke. If you like the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell and give us a like below. There's my finger telling you where the like button is. And until next Thursday, everybody take care. Larissa, you be good too.